Very welcome. Hello, everybody, to this first debate of a new series of the Montesquieu Institute and my paper Trouw on the state of democracy in Europe. It's a very short series this year, to our regret. Today we have some distinguished guests from the United Kingdom, and in a couple of days, I think the 17th of February, we have a debate with the youngest member of the European family, the Croatians. That's on a Monday. So today we talk about the state of democracy in Europe related to the position of the United Kingdom, which is always, in our view from the continent, a little bit peculiar and willful. And somehow we liked it, I think. So the guests today are Professor Deirdre Curtin. She's a professor of European law of the University of Amsterdam. And she also gives lectures at the University of Utrecht, I understand. And she is the head of a Center for Research of European Law and Governance in Amsterdam. 2008, she was rewarded with the the Spinoza Award. We have so many of these guys. And she's also a distinguished member of the Royal Academy of Science and Arts, KNAW. So her view on the European Parliament and the state of democracy was published in my paper on Tuesday. But if you missed it, you can hear it again now in a more extensive way. So I give the floor to Professor Deirdre Curtin.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the kind words and also for the opportunity to be here this afternoon and to engage in this debate. Both with the distinguished member of the European Parliament and with all of you. I'm delighted to do so. Sorry about the technical problems, which has delayed us slightly. I'm not actually going to talk about, because I decided to take the perspective, rather than talking about the referendum again and the special position that is claimed by some in the United Kingdom, and the special treatment. I mean, other countries also from time to time argue for special treatment for varying reasons, so arguably that is not necessarily so unique. But in any event, I wanted to give it a different sort of twist today, especially since the overall theme that we are dealing with in this series of debates is the state of democracy in Europe. So I wanted to relate what was happening in the UK to that very key issue, it seems to me, particularly at this moment in time. Now, I'm not so much going to take issue as such with the European Parliament, although that is part, I think, of the debate, and I'm sure that will come back in the discussions, and it's definitely an important part of the panorama, but instead to dwell more on the role of national parliaments in the context of what is happening in the European Union. And that is something that the UK, in a way, has very squarely put on the agenda. I mean, David Cameron's Bloomberg speech, already from some time ago, one of the very important points that he highlighted, and he really didn't do much more than that, and I've put it there in a quote, it's the national parliaments which are and will remain the true source of real democratic legitimacy and accountability in the European Union. So that was my desire today, and well, in the short piece that I wrote in the newspaper, was to focus on this, because this is something, in fact, that I believe, and I'm sure others will agree, it's not something that should only be executive driven, that the governments should come up with their idea as to whether new powers should be given to the national parliaments, or how they should cooperate, or how they should organise themselves institutionally. This is also something that has to live bottom up, both in the individual national parliaments themselves, but also collectively at the horizontal level, that they need to cooperate more and more, and arguably, I would say, more intensively than is the current case. So that's why a very interesting House of Commons report that was published in November, just before Christmas, that it was also the product of a lot of debate within the committee that adopted, but also they took a lot of evidence from various actors, governments, commissioners, members of civil society. They visited also other parliaments who have reformed procedures and that they considered interesting. In fact, both the Netherlands and Ireland, which happens to be the two countries I'm a citizen of, but by coincidence. And their vision really was to propose improvements, and I've quoted it, in the interests of Parliament, that is, of course, the UK Parliament, the electors, and in the national interest. And I'm not going to get into a lot of technical detail as to the specifics of that. I use it more as an occasion to raise the more general issues. But it bears reading for those interested in the content of European democracy at this point in time on a number of different levels: structural, informational, and what I would call oppositional, if you like, in terms of a possible veto or otherwise. So in a sense, one of my theses is, no, in fact, the UK is not necessarily unique, but it has also a valuable contribution and a voice that is not only a government-driven one, but coming from the parliaments themselves. There is an interesting engagement going on that is constructive. Now, why is that important? That relates to what I would say is the phenomenon and the intensification, if you like, of the phenomenon of executive dominance in Europe post-crisis. And I'm not going to get into that to a large extent today, because my subject is another one, but that's the kind of backdrop as to why accountability, democratic accountability, both at the national level and at the European level, is particularly important. And there are those who thought, after the Lisbon Treaty, that, we've been talking, of course, about the democratic deficit for many years, but there has been a large focus on the legislative, on more of a role, in particular, of the European Parliament at the legislative level. That has been achieved, pretty whole scale. At the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament has accentuated powers in other directions, most importantly with regard to the negotiation of international agreements, which is becoming ever more important also, and the subject of debate. Also here in the Netherlands, for example, the EU-US free trade area, or however it will ultimately be called. But so what we see happening is basically more power to executive actors. And by executive actors, I mean non-legislative and non-judicial. That's something that should resonate with the Montesquieu Institute, which is hosting this. And the clearest examples are the European Council, the increased power of the European Council. That's something that we notice also in our newspapers on a more and more regular way than was previously the case in terms of the kinds of decisions that are being taken at that level. For example, to push ahead with banking union, to give more power to the European Central Bank, new tasks for the Commission, which, as we know, include coming now to national capitals and having a say over national budgets. So there's a multiplicity of actors who are being given new executive-type tasks, and it's not that we can say, well, it's all supranational or something. It's not. It's complicated. I mean, obviously, the European Commission is supranational. So is the European Central Bank. That's different for the European Council and the Council of Ministers. But how is that being controlled, or how is that power being held to account at any level, European or national? That is the crucial question. So accountability, basically, is the key. And just to give you a definition that I've worked with and also studied empirically, but I think it's an easy definition to get. It's basically very simple. It's a relationship between an actor and a forum in which the actor has an obligation to explain and to justify his or her conduct. The forum can pose questions and pass judgment, and the actor may face consequences. So you see, it's quite an open definition. It can involve a lot of different accountability forms. They can be democratic, or they can be constitutional, they can be more legal, or they can be more of a regulatory nature, and the degrees of powers that are given can vary. The focus here is obviously on the democratic one, because that is the subject of the debate. And basically, what I'm showing you, this is as purely as background, but you'll see that there are a number of different accountability forums that are out there, both at the European level and at the national level, for the various different actors. And there's different degrees of an answer depending on the perspective you take as to the nature of the European integration process. But you'll see in the very first square, almost, with regard to the European Council, that a key role is to in terms of accountability, to national parliaments and the electorate. And there is some also to the European Parliament, if we keep it at the democratic level. I notice my watch doesn't seem to be working. There doesn't seem to be... Yeah, I have another 10 minutes or something? Yeah, that's fine. Right. So, basically, and these are issues that are teased out in the House of Commons scrutiny report, which is why I'm focusing on that and elaborating more on the article in the Trouw newspaper. So nowadays, in the current state of the European Union, it's really important that we talk about democratic accountability, not only with regard to legislation. And for national parliaments, it means not only with regard to the input of national civil servants and national governments into the European process, with the full involvement of the European Parliament as co-legislator, but very importantly, and this the House of Commons Scrutiny Committee is very good on, is the issue of non-legislation, which becomes ever more important. Actual formal EU-level legislation is a tiny part, an important part, but a small part of what the European Union actually does. And there's a whole array of other instruments and policy areas that do not result in legislation as such, and particularly important, the common foreign security policy, but also, for example, the operation of the European Central Bank or the negotiation of international agreements. And one of the issues that I think national parliaments in particular, and this is also highlighted by the House of Commons, finds particularly challenging, is at what point do they get information on time to make a difference. And what they are highlighting in particular is the need to have what they call upstream information. In other words, information at the very, very early stages. So not when things have been more or less finally negotiated or whatever, but no, If it's going through, for example, the council, well, to have information already at the working party stage when it's being negotiated by civil servants, and so on. So this is a really important issue, and this is something that is, again, it's not unique to the United Kingdom, but is an issue for national parliaments. And also here in the Netherlands, this is something that the Tweede Kamer struggles with. So this is an example, because one thing I would like to highlight, I couldn't, because I didn't have enough words in Trouw, mention it, but is the role of courts in this. I'll just very briefly mention that, in reinforcing, if you like, democracy and democratic accountability. And that is actually quite interesting, because we've seen it, the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, as a result of cases that are brought before it, for example, by civil society organizations. There's been an important one recently where the court gave judgment last year, called Access Info Europe, a non-governmental organization challenging the lack of transparency in early stage legislative proceedings. And basically their claim was upheld, where the court ruled that the input of national governments in council working parties is basically the equivalent of national legislative procedures, and that there needed to be transparency in that regard. Of course, it remains to be seen, and it remains, those who are realistic know that it remains a struggle, an ongoing institutional struggle. It's all very well to say that in a judgment, but how do the institutions apply it in practice? And it can go back and forth for many years. We've seen that in other instances. But there can also be national judicial catalysts that reinforce democracy and reinforce the role of national parliaments at the national level. And we've seen a clear example of that 2 years ago in a judgment on the European Stability Mechanism by the Bundesverfassungsgericht, who emphasized that the Bundestag in particular needed to get more information in a more comprehensive manner and at an earlier stage. And the result of that judgment, in fact, and some people say, oh, well, it wasn't the Parliament itself pushing for it, but it was kind of imposed by the court. You know, at the end of the day, I wonder, does that really matter? What matters is there was a mandatory law adopted on cooperation between the German government and the Bundestag, which as I've said, imposes a mandatory obligation on the German government to supply a very wide range of information. And if you read that act, it's actually very impressive. I was looking for it. I realized that it had come out the beginning of last summer, and Googled it, and it was immediately available with an English translation, which was wonderful. I thought I would have to struggle with complex German constructions, but it had been translated into English and was perfectly well, I won't say perfectly simple, but it was readily understandable. And I was very impressed by the range of situations that were covered, the kind of information. So it wasn't only classic European Union stuff, you know, the main institutional stuff. It was also informal mechanisms. For example, it was also the various international agreements to do with the crisis that were adopted outside the European Union would have been covered, Eurogroup meetings, Euro summits, all of these kinds of things, as well as preparatory bodies, working groups of the institutions, even the meetings of trialogues. And the minutes and that, which are these informal negotiations that take place in early stage legislative proceedings between the Parliament, the Commission, the Council, and which are kept secret, at least for the outside world. They were also included. So very impressive. What we see happening is that across the board, actually, and in this sense, you know, what I'm saying is not really, I think, a pessimistic story. It is, I hope, a realistic story, but I'm not entirely without optimism. Because what we actually see happening, you know, if you take a longer perspective, The national parliaments, I think, in the last 2 to 3 years, it's fair to say, have become more and more conscious of the need to get to grips, of this feeling that it's slipping out of their hands, which it has been for a while, but also in new ways, and in getting to grips with it. And it doesn't really matter what system you have, because whether you have, for example, as in Denmark, you have a negotiation mandate is given to the government from the parliament, or you have a committee that is very active, such as the Finnish Grand Committee, or you have, like in the UK, where it's an ex post and document-based system. You still see, for example, across quite a wide range of national parliaments, that they are holding more and more plenary debates on important issues before also European Council meetings, not just afterwards, so that the Prime Minister has to come and account, but before that. And that's a phenomenon that's happening right across the board. And that's happening, by the way, in the Netherlands as well. I saw some statistics, and it's over the years, perhaps the last 5 years. Now, there were hardly any until about 2 years ago, and suddenly there's, I think in both last year and the year before, over 10, I think 12 or 13, but in any event, quite considerable. So this has happened to a lesser extent, actually, in the UK, because, this is the problem with national parliaments, and this is why it's said, you can't have a unitary EU-imposed solution that covers all national parliaments, and I think that's certainly the case, because, of course, every national parliament has its own particular constitutional setup, and the way it fits into the national constitutional system has its own peculiarities. So you can't just have one solution fits all right across the board. And I think in the United Kingdom, at least from what I've read on it, it's particularly difficult to have plenary debates, perhaps more so than many other parliaments. But I'm sure there's an English constitutional lawyer who can talk more about that. But one thing that comes out in the report is the need to for the Parliament to get information, and also to get information in what they call informal information, that doesn't fall within, and I'm not going to get too technical here, but part of the European Communities Act is that, and part of the setup with regard to the national parliaments is that documents need to be you have to define quite precisely what documents need to be deposited, and once they're deposited, they need to be made public. So that can't apply to confidential information. So that's a big issue, and that's something that I hope we will have time for in the debate. Confidential or sensitive information, by the way, is not classified information. So I'm not talking about highly secret information for which you need a security clearance. That's a different matter, and there are different procedures for that, and it's quite often quite accepted that that obviously cannot happen publicly. But I'm talking about obligations of professional secrecy, and there are a lot of so-called limited documents, as I'm sure those of you who study the EU will know. And these are decided on the basis of the rules of procedure of the institutions themselves, in which the governments participate and agree upon, but nobody actually knows it's going on until they've actually been agreed and published, the rules. And now national parliaments are being confronted, in effect, with a fait accompli that they can't do anything about. And this is a matter that the Dutch Parliament has recently found a way around, when it was realised that it was one of the, comparatively speaking, few national parliaments not to get access to these kind of documents. It has now been given access, in fact, in quite a far-reaching manner, in the sense that the members of Parliament have direct access to the same database that the government does, and so can see it can also see at this stage what documents it's not getting as well as those that it gets. So, you know, and this is something that the House of Commons clearly is less far in its thinking in terms of where this go, but you see the similar parallels arising. I'm probably running a little bit out of time here, am I? Another?
If you take 2 minutes more.
That's fine. That's fine. No problem. So I'm coming to the end. In any event, I have the slide, of course, and the European Parliament, because I have deliberately talked about the national parliaments, because I think that there isn't enough thinking about really fleshing out how we can engage the national parliaments more in the European integration process. And I don't see it as an either-or situation. I think it's and. So it's both the national parliaments getting more to grips, both with their own ministers and prime minister in the national context, but also horizontally, cooperating more proactively with other national parliaments, but also the role of the I'm not trying to say there is no role for the European Parliament. Clearly there needs to be an accountability forum at the European level that can look at the collectivity of the actor, not only at the individual components, but also at the actor as a whole. But that is where, at the moment, there is a real gap. A lot has happened. There has been a lot of progress, but in terms of where the power has, to a large extent, moved to, the European Council in particular, or the Council of Ministers, there, the role, the accountability relationship, if you like, between the European Parliament and those actors is actually still quite thin. And I think this is something that we need to think about more, but I'm sure the next speaker is going to talk to you about that. And basically, and I think I had the thrust of that also in the newspaper articles, if there is a desire for more balance, more checks and balances on executive power, then I think information, publicity, and even what I referred to in the article, parliamentary disobedience, there is a need for that. And that, you know, as I mentioned, the case of the United Kingdom, being disobedient in a sense and disobeying these low-level EU rules, putting information out there that was clearly not confidential. I mean, it wasn't information that was going to make a bank fall or anything like that, or that really affected negotiations with third parties. That can also show the way to other parliaments. And I'll close with that image, also the Dutch Tweede Kamer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Curtin, for your clear overall view on the balance of power, which is even, you did it very compact, even if it's very complex. I'd like to introduce to you the next speaker. It's Sir Graham Watson. We are very glad you're here, sir, because, moreover, because the region where Sir Graham comes from is Langton, Somerset, the area which is severely hit by a water flood. So we appreciate it that you are here, and maybe you should be at home, but we're glad you're here. So Sir Graham is now a member of the European Parliament for the LD fraction, the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats and Reformists in the European Parliament. At the same time, he is president of the ELDR, the party of Liberals and Democrats for Europe. And I'd like to give him the floor now.
Well, thank you very much, Hans, and for that kind welcome. You are right, my constituency is pretty much underwater at the moment. And it shows that actually the work done by the Dutch engineers in the 17 and 1800s of digging the drainage channels to allow us to farm the land more effectively has lasted until the onset of man-made climate change. We need some more engineers. Please come. Venez nombreux, as the French would say. Thank you for inviting me today. I was invited by the Montesquieu Institute to come and speak to you in response to Deirdre Curtin's article, Can the Skeptic UK Bring New Ideas on Democracy to Europe? And my very first reaction was to say to Miriam van Dorp, who invited me, of course I would be honoured to come, but I can think off the top of my head of at least 10 people far better qualified than I am to address this subject. And Miriam said, well, so can we, Sir Graham, but they've all turned us down. So here I am. It's a particular honour to be invited by Hans Goslinga, who has himself done so much thinking and writing on the role of the nation-state, and who, as a winner of the European Journalist Award, the Wundeling Prize, the Heldring Prize, and no doubt others, is an eminent analyst of the challenges that we face. And Dr. Curtin has, of course, pioneered the concept of compound constitutions in Europe. She has studied the relationship between the citizen and the state in works such as her book on accountability and European governance, and her book Top Secret Europe, and as Hans said, has been awarded the prestigious Spinoza Prize for her work. My own history is that I come originally from Scotland. I was the son of a Royal Naval officer who dragged his family around the empire. After university, I went through a series of short-lived careers as a freelance professional, and then in the public sector, and then in private industry, before I recognized at about the age of 40 that I was really qualified to do nothing, so I had no choice but to go into politics. And as a politician, I will do what I expect politicians to do on these occasions, which is to delve deeply into the surface of the matter. I would, however, like to sketch a few ideas on three of the issues that Deirdre Curtin has raised. The role of the nation-state as we build a European Union. On the issue of accountability of government to the citizen, if you are doing more and more things together in Brussels. And on the position and the posture of the United Kingdom towards our common European project. Let me start with the role of the nation-state and say, as the Irishman famously said to the visitor who asked for directions, well, I wouldn't start from here. If you overlook the awful ethnic cleansing of North America's indigenous inhabitants, you might conclude that the advantage enjoyed by the United States of America in building a federal state is that they started from a blank sheet. They could do anything they wanted. De Tocqueville's observation that the middle classes were, somewhat to his surprise, capable of making a reasonable fist of governing when he visited America, I think betrays as much about the difficulty in Europe of moving away from monarchy as it does about the potential for democracy in North America at that time. But I think America's founding fathers were indeed fortunate compared to Monet and Schumann and Spaak. In June of this year, I was pleased to welcome to the European Parliament in Brussels an exhibition to mark the 300th anniversary of something for which you guys are responsible, the Treaty of Utrecht. The treaty is quite well known among MEPs because it shaped so many member states of modern-day Europe. It may have done so for better or for worse, often depending on your point of view, and of course the Treaty of Utrecht means very different things to different countries. But for all of the faults of the European Union, since Utrecht, we no longer try to abrogate by force the agreements we have signed. We have a simple rule: pactus sunt servanda, and the treaties of Utrecht are just as much a part of Europe's constitutional history as the Treaty of Versailles or the Treaty of Rome. The Treaty of Utrecht was not a blank sheet, nor was it a tidy piece of constitutional design. And I can tell you, as a member of the European Parliament, elected to represent the southwest of England and Gibraltar, I have been rather busy dealing with just one of the hangovers that Utrecht left us, as any of you who have visited that remarkable rock will know. But the Treaty of Utrecht could in some ways be said to be the harbinger of the modern federal state. And if you look back over the 18th century, you see that as the century progressed, we saw the development of ideas of identity and social organization, which were hugely advanced for their day. The avant-garde thinkers of that time had little trouble imagining a world of nations at peace with one another. Take, for example, my compatriot from Scotland, Robert Burns, who wrote in the middle of the century, "The world would live in peace, man. The sword would help to make a plough. The din of war would cease. Like brethren in a common cause, we'd on each other smile, and equal rights and equal laws would gladden every isle." You know, the optimism of the 18th century is quite infectious. The idea of European countries coming together to debate and talk through their problems rather than resolve them through war grew along with the ideas of the dignity and the rights of humankind. The development of the curiously retrograde concept of the military-industrial nation-state came quite a lot later. Until 1917, you could travel from Edinburgh to St. Petersburg without a passport. In terms of denying freedom, the 20th century and the military-industrial nation-state actually has a lot to answer for. And I would contend that the nation-state has at least as much restricted as it has expanded human freedom. It has, moreover, bequeathed to us challenges such as those posed by my home country, my country of birth, Scotland, and by Catalonia, to say nothing of Kosovo. The ideas of that great American liberal Woodrow Wilson of the right to self-determination of peoples are not yet a spent force. Until the fall of Soviet communism, many of us hoped, through the development of the European Union, that Europe's 20th century rage of self-mutilation had expired. The former Yugoslavia taught us otherwise. Whether we can now turn the page of a shared history of a century which Europe soaked in blood into the common purpose of a shared future of peace and prosperity is still not entirely yet clear. Look at the debate that's going on in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands about whether the European Union is a good thing. I think there has been a fundamental change in the European Union in the 20 years that I've had the honor to serve in the European Parliament. And yet it has nothing to do with the fact that the European Union has grown from the 12 countries that were there when I was first elected to the 28 countries now, or the fact that we have moved from what was then a very, very limited competence of the European Union through the treaties of Maastricht and Amsterdam and Nice and Lisbon to a much more complex state now. The big change has been in the minds of our heads of state and government. And I wager that if you had gone 14 years ago, at the turn of the century, to the President of France or the Chancellor of Germany or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and you'd put the question, why is your country in the European Union? they would have given you one of two answers. Either they would have said, the European Union has given us the longest unbroken period of peace that we have known in the history of our continent, or they would have said, perhaps they would have said, the explosion of trade which came about as a result of the European single market has given us levels of prosperity that our grandparents and even our parents could never have dreamt of. But I bet that if you went today to Angela Merkel or François Hollande or David Cameron or even Mark Rutte and you said, why is your country in the Union? They'd give you a completely different answer. They would talk about how on certainly a weekly and often a daily basis, the biggest challenges they have to deal with are global challenges. They are challenges arising from rapid world population growth and greater pressures for migration than we have ever known, or from the challenge of climate change and the related challenge of energy security, or from the threat of internationally organized crime linked to terrorism. Now, the European Union is not the only answer, and certainly not a complete answer to these problems. And we are all members of the United Nations and NATO and various other bodies. But the European Union is the body that gives these national leaders the most effective lever that they have to get on top of the challenges they face. And so the role of the nation state, let me say here more accurately, the member state, because some of our member states contain more than one nation, the role of the member state is unclear. We no longer speak in the treaties of ever closer union. Perhaps we are in ever closer disunion. Election results last year in Italy, France, and the United Kingdom. In Italy, a populist party led by a stand-up comic took 25% of the vote in a general election. In France, Marine Le Pen and the Front National took 24% of the vote in communal elections. In the United Kingdom Independence Party took 26% of the vote in local elections. This is not a here today, gone tomorrow phenomenon. This is a symbol of something far deeper, linked no doubt to the difficulties of the recession we are going through, but by no means exclusively a phenomenon of that. And I mentioned only 3 countries, but look at the PVV, look at the Vlaams Belang, look at the True Finns. Those parties exist everywhere except Germany, because Germany has had the most effective education about the dangers that can be posed by such parties. Now let me touch secondly on the issue of accountability. And this is something that Professor Curtin has done a lot of work on and touched on today. Most politicians in Europe, irrespective of party, would agree that transparency in government is a good thing. Indeed, I would argue that it is a prerequisite of good governance. It empowers citizens. It gives our citizens the opportunity to scrutinize and to evaluate the activity of public authorities and to hold them to account. It increases the citizens' understanding of decision-making, and it makes freedom of speech a much more powerful tool. One of the problems we have in the European Union, as Deirdre Curtin said, is people don't feel they have enough information about what is going on. And partly the European Union itself is to blame. The principle of openness was not introduced into European Union law until the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992, and even then only very hesitantly. Declaration number 17, an appendix to the treaty on the right of access to information, had the goal of strengthening the democratic nature of the EU institutions and the public's confidence in the administration. It took a long time to have effect. True, in 1993, the Commission and the Council adopted a code of conduct on access to documents, There were detailed conditions laid down by Commission and Parliament for access to information, but it was not until the Article 255 of the Treaty of Amsterdam embedded the right of access to information in all three institutions that any real progress was made. Now, I can tell you, I'm not sure I have time, but I can tell you a lovely story about how we negotiated Article 255. I was the chairman of Parliament's Justice and Home Affairs Committee at the time. We appointed two rapporteurs, a British socialist called Michael Cashman and a Dutch Christian Democrat called Hanja Maijveggen. And together we negotiated in a very, very short period, because we had only a 6-month Swedish presidency of the European Union, and we knew that no other government of the European Union would give us a decent access to documents regulation. So we negotiated in 6 months an agreement, and the final deal was done as I was sailing a small sailing boat up the channel in a force 5 gale. Well, it's not quite a gale, but anyway, a force 5 wind. And the Swedish permanent representative, Gunnar Lund, was sitting with a gin and tonic in his hand and his feet up at a hotel on the Red Sea on Easter Day of 2001, I think it was. And we clinched the final deal by mobile phone. That's sometimes how legislation is made. But anyway, I can tell you more about it. But what was the aim of it? The aim was, we recognize that there's a problem. We recognize that the citizens don't know about what's going on, so we are going to ensure the widest possible access to documents, the easiest possible exercise of the right to information. We're going to promote good administrative practice. And we tried to embody the Nordic concept of public access to documents, the right to request access without the need to specify any reason. Now, what we did worked partly. It worked very well if you're a public affairs professional. Not badly if you're a journalist. It didn't work terribly well if you're average member of the public who wants access, even particularly if you're an MEP. We had a review of it in 2005. The Commission adopted something they called the European Transparency Initiative. It led to a new Commission proposal in 2008. Nothing has happened on that yet. Parliament said, no, we don't like the choice of recast procedure that you're using. We voted a resolution in March of 2009, but basically said we refer the matter to the next Parliament. And in this last Parliament, we've carried on arguing over a number of issues. What are the issues? Number one, how do you define a document? There are lots of documents in circulation that are not officially called documents, so the public can't have access to them. Number two, why do you exclude legal advice? Because actually knowing what advice you've had from your lawyers can tell you a heck of a lot about whether the decision you've made is a sensible one. Number three, why should the member states have a right to restrict access to documents that they pass on to the European institutions? Number four, what is the relation between the right of access and data protection? Number five, well, I could go on and on and on. But what all this did is it led to another proposal from the European Commission in March 2011, and we're still really no further forward to getting that agreed. The European Commission has a rate of refusal of about 30% on access to documents, far too high. We need to shift from the concept of access to documents to the concept of freedom of information, and we will probably need a special ombudsman or a freedom of information commissioner. Let me give you an example. I represent Gibraltar. The European Commission finally took up my suggestion and sent monitors down to the border to see how the Spanish are restricting rights of free movement. They came back and they sent a letter to the Spanish government and a letter to the British government. The Spanish government wouldn't publish the letter, nor would the Commission. So I had to put down an access to documents request to get the letter. I then published it on the internet, And of course it was embarrassing for the Spanish because it looked as if they'd been trying to hide something. But, you know, all of this lack of transparency leads to public mistrust, as Deirdre has said, and that is where the role of national parliaments has to be far better. National parliaments, some do very good scrutiny of what's going on at European level. I think the Danish parliament is the best. The German parliament is not bad. The Dutch parliament has got a lot better recently. The Finnish parliament is pretty good. The United Kingdom parliament has been lousy until recently, but it is beginning to get better. Actually, the House of Lords has always done a good job, but sadly its work very rarely gets carried in the newspapers. The United Kingdom Parliament is playing catch-up, and just last month they produced a report which said, we need reporters to take European issues through committees. Very interestingly, they chose a European term, a rapporteur. They said we need a more coordinated approach to the Commission's work programme. They said we need a question time on EU questions. We need better coverage of European issues by the BBC. They certainly do. They want to strengthen the scrutiny reserve, where our government can say, OK, we agree to something, but only pending approval by our parliament. And most ridiculous of all the others at work, but they said, we want a form of national veto over EU legislative proposals. How on earth is the European Union going to work if every parliament has a national veto over European legislative proposals? It just doesn't work. But what we have seen, and what we're seeing in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, is a greater demand for information by national parliaments, which is a good thing. B, a greater assertion of the role of national parliaments, which I think is not a bad thing, although they don't use all the opportunities available to them at the present. But C, something which is a little more worrying. You're seeing, particularly in Germany, the Bundesverfassungsgericht become the arbiter of European decisions, whether they go ahead or not. You cannot run a European Union on that basis. And Deirdre puts David Cameron's quote, "The true source of democratic legitimacy and accountability is the national parliament." If I were a professor of a university, I would add, discuss. I do not believe that the national parliament is the true source. I believe it is a source, an important source, of legitimacy and accountability. But so is the European Parliament, so in many countries our our regional parliaments, or even local government. And unless we properly understand the proper relations between those different instances of government, we will never have a fully functioning democracy at European level. What has happened, just very briefly recently, interparliamentary meetings. There is hardly a Monday or a Tuesday goes by in Brussels without a meeting of at least 3 members of every national parliament, plus members of the European Parliament discussing a particular area of European legislation. Normally cross-questioning the commissioner responsible, sometimes calling in the High Representative for Foreign Affairs if that's the issue, or the chairman of the Euro group if it's to do with management of the Euro, and so on. That has been a big step forward in common management or common scrutiny of what is going on. The second big step forward, cross-fertilization of members of parliament. People who have served in national parliaments serving in the European Parliament. That's happened for a long time, but increasingly people who've served in the European Parliament serving in national parliaments. Your Minister of Defence is a good example. She served a number of years in the European Parliament. She's now Minister of Defence in the Netherlands. She knows how Europe works. The cross-fertilization of staff is also very helpful. The yellow card procedure introduced in the Lisbon Treaty, where a number of national parliaments coming together can hold up European legislation, saying, no, stop, we want further discussion of this, we want to know that the European Union is acting within its competences, and so on. And these are all things that can be done, and increasingly will be done. Which brings me to the painful issue of the position of the United Kingdom. I'm going to bring this to a close. All I would say is this: 20 miles of water, over 2,000 years of history, has presented us with quite a big challenge. We had the experience of invasion through William the Conqueror. We had the experience of invading through Henry V. While I'm on the Henrys, I would say, as Henry VIII used to say to his wives, "Don't worry, I won't keep you long." We had the break with the Church of Rome. We had the development of the common law system in England and Wales. We had for a while a doctrine of 19th century prime ministers about a balance of power on the continent. No country should be too weak, but no country should be too strong. And since the Second World War, we've had a consensus to engage in the creation and participate in the functioning of institutions of international governance. 1974 was probably the high water mark of pro-Europeanism in the United Kingdom. In 1975, the government came in and had a referendum on whether we should pull out again. We voted to stay in. Probably we would vote to stay in again. But in the meantime, we've had not only a series of governments who have had a different view, perhaps pandering to public opinion, certainly afraid of the newspapers owned by a Canadian called Conrad Black or an Australian-American called Rupert Murdoch. If you want to know about them, read the biography of Harold Evans, former editor of The Times, wrote a lovely book called Good Times, Bad Times. We've seen a move from a parliamentary style of government in the United Kingdom to a presidential style of government. Members of Parliament have been bought off with longer holidays. We've seen increasingly poor scrutiny of governmental decisions at every level, not just at European level, other than in the House of Lords. We've even seen a generation of legislators and broadcasters emerge who do not fully understand how the European Union works. And we're just beginning to get to grips with that. The poet Kipling posed the question, what does he know of England who only England knows? And that is actually a valid question today. And as a result of all this, we've seen the growth of one of the strongest anti-European parties in the United Kingdom, infecting one of our major parties of government, which has pulled out of the European People's Party, which is wanting to pull the United Kingdom out of the European arrest warrant and other areas of justice and home affairs, and is being prevented only by a junior coalition partner, which is the party to which I belong, the Liberal Democrats. But we've also seen as a result of this a balance of competences review, which has educated our legislators about what the European Union does. And partly as a result of that, we saw the Conservative whips pull the referendum bill last week. We are not bound to have a referendum in 2017. And I'm going to end, if I might, on that point, because I think it is now accepted by all parties that there will be a referendum in the near future in the United Kingdom about our membership of the European Union. But it is most likely that it would be held on the next treaty change. And the question has to be, do you want to stay in or do you want out? Because the status quo is not an option. And the only honourable course, if you don't want the new treaty, a treaty which our government will have been involved in negotiating, is to sue for an amicable divorce. Well, my prediction is that we won't. And I end with a quote from Chesterton in his poem The Silent People, where he has a chorus line that goes, smile at us, pay us, pass us, but never quite forget that we are the people of England who have not spoken yet. I think when the people speak, they'll speak in favour of staying in.
Thank you very much, Sir Graham. I promise you, next time we will call Brussels, we ask for you straight away and leave the others. I think nobody will blame you for taking time of the debate, which we rest. I think we have half an hour for that. We have a lot of fundamental things raised about the structure and the procedures And you spoke especially about the content, with the most difficult question: how to form, how to build a federation out of long-existing or not long-existing nation states, including maybe the ghosts we thought belonged to the past. So I will give room for the audience. Come up with your questions. There's somebody over there walking around, Jesse, with a microphone. I will take the other part of the, and may I invite you at the cathedral. So who wants the honor to have the first question?
A very good afternoon. My name is Khalid Chaudhry from International Human Rights Commission. Sir Graham, you mentioned Rudyard Kipling, and I was thinking about what would you say about the gulf between West and the East while we are living in a globalized world. A couple of weeks ago, the former German foreign minister was here. After a debate, I was talking to him, and I said how tragic is the situation that for us, the global South, the European Union have been a source of inspiration. The democracies have been the source of inspiration. But right now, the right wing, extreme right wing, which you already mentioned, they are trying to invade the European Union. And unfortunately, right in this country, the opinion polls are saying that the party of Mr. Wilders is going to have a majority. So I have a question. Who you are going to blame? Is that the liberal parties and other established political parties nationally, at national level and at the European Union level who have been failed to deliver, and that's why these extreme right-wing parties are taking a lead, or it's something else? Thank you.
Well, your question, sir, is an interesting one. As I'm sure people will all be aware, the Honourable Gentleman cited Kipling and the line which goes, "East is east and west is west, and ne'er the twain shall meet." It's a very interesting poem to read. The question is this: yes, is the European Union about to fall apart in a way that will disappoint not only, I think, the global South, but the protesters in the Ukraine, for example, and many others who actually want to be part of this European Union? It seems that while lots of others either want to be part of it or to have something similar, we ourselves have lost faith in, or are losing faith in, the whole project. Why? Well, I think that, as I said, that recession is a large part of it. We've been through the deepest recession since the 1920s. We're probably lucky not to have lost any country into totalitarian or authoritarian government. I have three reasons why I think that has not happened. Number one, universal unemployment benefit and universal sickness insurance have cushioned the blow of recession. Number two, higher levels of education have made people more aware of the dangers of parties offering simple or simplistic solutions. But number three, we created the euro. And we had a man called Jean-Claude Trichet who had the guts in that crucial week of September 2008, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, to inject 100 billion euros onto the markets every night to calm the speculators. He also had deep enough pockets, but he didn't have much political cover. It was quite a courageous decision. But I think those factors are all important. But I think we need to look too at the way in which some of these anti-European movements are being financed. It was interesting to see that Geert Wilders' study today was done together with Capital Economics. And some of these are being financed by financial interests in the hedge funds and so on, which don't really want to see a change. They don't want to see Europe become too powerful, or the euro become a world currency to rival the dollar. Don't forget that the Americans make, I think, $400 billion a year simply through having the world's reserve currency. I'm not suggesting, please don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting the American government is trying to bring down Europe. But there are certain financial organizations who might have an interest in it. What can we do about it? Who will be blamed if it all comes down? Well, liberals will be blamed. Liberals are always blamed for everything, by definition. Go to France or Italy or Spain, liberal is a dirty word at the moment. You call yourself a liberal, it's like, being a freewheeling casino capitalist who doesn't give a damn about people's livelihoods. But I think that actually, if we fail, it will be the political establishment which fails to have the courage to go out and talk to people about why it pursues the policies it does.
Jan Hoekema. So if you would be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom today, you would be asked the question, why Europe? Would you give the 2000 answer, meaning peace, security, prosperity and trade, or the 2014 answer, there are no national solutions for international problems?
I'd give you, heaven forfend that it should ever happen, but I would give you the latter answer. Call me a crazy, starry-eyed idealist if you like, but when I look at the world we live in today, I am increasingly minded to think that unless we can come up with an effective form of global governance, then none of us stand a cat in hell's chance of handing down a planet or a society to our children and our grandchildren that's worth having.
So I've just got a question. What do you think can be done on a local level to kind of have some sort of more engagement for people from the UK with the European Union? Do you think that's a good way to try and kind of counteract anti-EU attitudes?
Well, I think Deirdre is probably better qualified than I am to answer that. All I would say is we need better education. The biggest or the worst development that I've seen in the last 20 years, and here I really do contrast the United Kingdom with most countries of continental Europe, has been the dumbing down of news coverage. With the honourable exception of the Financial Times, if you pick up any daily newspaper today, at least 2 column inches in every 5, and in some cases 3 or 4 column inches in every 5, are about the lives of celebrities. They're not about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I have an awful lot to add on that. I think it needs to start also, education obviously is very important in the schools, but also media coverage. I mean, one of the things in this House of Commons report that they wanted to go back to was the BBC wouldn't even come and give evidence, so there's a problem there also in terms of getting interest, at least in the UK context. But it's political parties, obviously, involving youth in sort of youth political parties and engaging with Europe in that way, civil society organisations. But, I'm not saying that's a panacea for anything, but it certainly, there needs to also be a bottom-up engagement that needs to live at that level as well. But again, I wouldn't say there's anything unique to the UK in that, needs to happen in all member states, basically.
Montesquieu from PMDDI. I suppose my question is quite simple. Rather than looking at everyone else to solve the problem and saying it's this and access to information, surely we can just ask, shouldn't the European Union have better PR?
Well, I mean, for many years, the European Commission resisted this because they said, look, we've got a limited budget. It's not our job. It's the job of the member states to tell people about why Europe is important. So they did nothing about it. More recently, they have started to, and we are spending more and more money. I'm just taking through the Foreign Affairs Committee at the moment a report on the use of broadcasting in EU diplomacy. And the suggestion is that if we were able to develop, properly finance, properly structure something like Euronews into becoming a truly European broadcaster, then it would firstly help us define our own positions, and would certainly help us communicate those positions, not only to Europeans, but to the outside world as well. But yes, PR is not well done, and I can tell you that as one of only 72 members of the European Parliament from the United Kingdom, I sometimes feel that what I do every Thursday and Friday and many Saturdays, going around my constituency talking about the European Union, is a bit like Don Quixote, getting his lance and charging at the windmills. But I do it nonetheless.
I'd just like to add to that. I mean, I think we also need to be careful that sort of the communication about what is being done and why it's being done isn't a substitute for actual information and the raw ingredients of what is actually happening and how it's happening. And I know some years ago the Commission in particular really tried hard to sell that it wasn't important, that information is that. What was more important was indeed communication, and to communicate better. And there have been various attempts to do that. But I think from a non-inside perspective, I think it's really important to look critically at that as well, because if not, what is PR? It can be just spin as well, selling it. Is that what we want? So not to be told the truth, but to be given a certain spin on situations.
Could I add to that? There's an Italian journalist called Pepe Severnini who has a lovely idea. He says, every year we celebrate Europe on the 9th of May. We have Europe Day. So we should also have a No Europe Day. In other words, we should have a day where you bring back the border controls and the customs clearance procedures, where you reintroduce import tariffs, where you ban low-cost airlines, where you bring the satellites back down to Earth, where you stop police cooperation. Maybe then people would realize what Europe has achieved.
And I add a question to you, Sir Graham. You talked about the popularity of the European Union outside the European Union, and you mentioned Ukraine. Do you think, in your view, there is a limit to the space of the European Union? Should, for example, Turkey be a member?
I'm aware that I tread on very dangerous ground here. I think it was one of the founding fathers, I'm not sure if it was Monet or Schumann, who said that a country's European vocation is determined by the spirit of its citizens. In other words, if they want to be part, you should allow them to be part, unless they are clearly non-European. I personally have no difficulty with the idea of Turkey being in the European Union, providing Turkey meets the criteria to join. I'm not sure that Turkey has yet made its mind up on that. And while the current government gave us tremendous hope in the first 5 years of its life, the last 5 years have been tending in the other direction. I think Turkey is, I wouldn't like to say reverting to type, because that's not fair, but I think Turkey is really not sure about where it wants to go. I have slightly less difficulty seeing the Ukraine in the European Union, but I believe it will take us a hell of a long time. We should not underestimate the problems involved in fighting organized crime or serious corruption in a country like the Ukraine.
The past year there's been a rather interesting development that youth organizations from all countries in Europe have come together and made an organization of themselves to get involved with Europe and make sure that the youth in Europe has a voice as well. And how far do you think that the European Parliament and the other organizations would be willing to listen to them and actually give the youth a voice? Because it's just as much their Europe as it is the Europe of grown-ups.
Listen, we give you vast amounts of money. I was the Secretary General of the International Federation of Liberal and Radical Youth back in 1978, and we went to talk to what was then DG 10 of the European Commission, and we established a thing called the European Youth Forum. And since then, we've done lots of other youth policies, the most important of which has not been with organized youth organizations, it's been the Erasmus scheme, which has now had a number of million of people go through it. There's a lot more we could do and should do. But I think the best thing you can do is get together across frontiers. Do you know the single most important statistic, to my mind, from all of the wonderful statistics that come out of Eurostat, is the statistic on marriages. 1 in 6 marriages in the European Union is between people holding different country passports. Think about the implications of that in 25 years' time. You cannot turn fish soup back into an aquarium.
So, Graham, you say there's a lack of trust and a lack of education among the British people. But why then do you think that the people will vote yes to a treaty referendum or into a membership referendum?
Can I break all the rules of politics and give you a completely honest answer? Why do I think people will vote yes? Because I think in the end, however much people complain, they prefer what they know to what they don't know. It's actually the reason why I think that my compatriots in Scotland will vote against independence later this year, because there are too many uncertainties in independence, and what people know is not that bad, really. People in Scotland will vote in favour of independence, but in the second referendum, and that's after the people of England have voted to come out of the European Union.
Therefore, Janssen, could you anticipate a bit about what will happen after the elections for the European Parliament in May? Every political group has its own candidate. No one will have the majority, absolute majority. Now, will Parliament try to find consensus on a candidate, one candidate, more or less in the same way as you do for a president of the European Parliament?
This is a very interesting question. We are actually entering new territory in this. If you look at the Lisbon Treaty has an appendix. Actually, as it happens, I think it's number 17 again, as the access to information was. And it's an appendix that says each political party at European level shall choose its candidate for President of the European Commission. And that when the Council and the heads of state and government meet after the election, they will go first to the candidate of the party that has the largest number of seats in the European Parliament. And if that candidate is unable to command a majority in Parliament to become the President of the Commission, then they will go to the next best placed candidate, and so on. And there is, in the text of the treaty, an important change, whereas previously the Council has nominated and Parliament has approved, nowadays the Council nominates and Parliament elects, which gives the European Parliament actually quite a lot more power. Now, the political parties are in the process of choosing their candidates. The Socialists were first off because it was uncontested. Martin Schulz is their candidate for President of the Commission. Then we had the Liberal Democrats. Guy Verhofstadt is our candidate for President of the European Commission. The Greens have chosen a very bright young lady called Ska Keller. and the European People's Party on the 6th or the 7th of March will choose between Jean-Claude Juncker, Michel Barnier, Valdis Dombrovskis and Jyrki Katainen, the latter two being the Prime Ministers of Latvia and Finland, respectively. Will the European Council, after the European election, turn to one of those people and say, okay, you can become President of the Commission if you get a majority? Or will they say, as Angela Merkel has hinted, that, well, this is not an automatic process. We don't feel ourselves bound by the treaties. And if they do try to put somebody else in, will the European Parliament have the guts to say, sorry, we're not even going to vote as to whether to approve or reject this person, because this is against what it says in the treaties. The idea in the treaties was, if each party has its own candidate, there is then a debate between these candidates in the European election, and people will feel somehow closer to the European Union. It's an idea that I'd like to believe. I think over time it might be the case. But I think this will be a very hesitating first experiment in the run-up to the elections in May.
But it is the beginning of something new and very positive. I mean, it won't solve anything, and it won't be terribly definite necessarily this time round, but I do think it's an indication of a new direction, also a deepening of the relation, the political at the European level.
Last question already. I'm here. Yeah.
Thank you. How meaningful are the European treaties? Are they as strong as the commitment of the member states, as was the case with the Growth and Stabilization Pact? There was a 3% budget deficit norm, but not always that well maintained by member states. So how strong is a treaty? Is it as strong as the commitment of the member states?
Okay, thanks. As the example you give clearly illustrates, the member states have a huge role in that. But I think it's not only a matter of what the member states. There are other factors that come into play. And in particular, I think something that hasn't really been mentioned at all today is, for example, the power of the courts over the meaning and effects of the treaties. So it's not only just a member of, the member states individually or collectively, but it's also the power of a very central supranational actor such as the Court of Justice to say what the member states actually agreed to, and then to at least attempt to hold them to that with more or less success depending on the areas, but with a lot of success when it comes to a lot of crucial areas that are at the core of European integration.
I would agree with Deirdre. I think what's been remarkable in some respects is the extent to which procedures which involve coaxing and cajoling, sometimes naming and shaming member states, do actually work in getting them to change their behavior. But there may come a time, and it may not be far away, when a member state does something that is seriously in violation of the treaties, and there's no army or police force to send in to do anything about it. We came close to it when Viktor Orban started to interfere with the rule of law in Hungary through a process of pressure. He was persuaded not to make the constitutional changes that he would otherwise have made. But, suppose people took Deirdre's advice and there was parliamentary disobedience. Maybe we would send in the troops somehow.
No, what could happen is that the member state would be sued for infringement of, and that's, there's already been some indication that that's the thinking on that, which I think would then be interesting, because then it would become before another accountability forum, the court, and there would be, I shouldn't say there would be a public debate, because there wouldn't be that, but there would at least be some debate over the issue, and that perhaps wouldn't be such a bad thing.
So thank you very much for your contribution to this debate. We are very grateful to both of you, and we like to give you something for the way back. I don't know where it is, but... We should have given you a zodiac or another little boat. I present this to you, Ms. Professor Curtin. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks a lot again. I must make a compliment to the audience as well, actually, because it could be seen as a strong indication for the rising of a kind of European consciousness in Holland after all those years, from the start, from '51. With the community of steel and coal, we're now having a real political issue about Europe. So thank you very much. The next debate will be Monday, 17th of February. It's not the same place, I think, in the House of Europe. Thanks very much.